Long before mirrors, long before anything resembling a beauty industry, and long before humans had permanent settlements of any kind, archaeologists have found something that seems almost impossibly out of place for people focused purely on survival: pigment. Ground-up red ochre, careful preparation of colored minerals, and tools specifically designed for mixing and applying them, found at sites tens of thousands of years old, in locations scattered across nearly every inhabited continent. This wasn't food. It wasn't a tool for hunting or building. It served no direct nutritional or protective function that early researchers could easily explain. And yet early humans clearly valued it enough to seek it out, process it carefully, and, based on where patterns and residue found on human remains, apply it directly to their skin. The question is why a species fighting daily for survival would spend precious time and effort coloring their bodies at all. The oldest confirmed evidence of pigment use by early humans dates back roughly 100,000 years, found at sites in South Africa, where archaeologists uncovered what are essentially ancient makeup preparation kits, abalone shells used as mixing containers, ochre ground into fine powder, and evidence of the pigment being combined with other materials to create a paste-like substance. This predates modern human migration out of Africa by tens of thousands of years, which tells researchers something significant: body decoration wasn't a later cultural invention that spread from one lucky innovation. It appears to be one of the founding behaviors of modern human cognition itself, present at the very root of what eventually became every human culture that followed. To understand why this behavior emerged so early, it helps to look at what red ochre and similar pigments may have actually represented to early human groups beyond simple decoration. Some researchers argue that pigment use is tied directly to one of the most important cognitive leaps in human evolution: symbolic thought, the ability to use one thing to represent or communicate something else entirely. Applying colored pigment to skin in a specific pattern isn't a random or accidental behavior. It requires intention, planning, and, crucially, an assumption that other people observing that pattern will understand or respond to it in some socially meaningful way. This makes early pigment use one of the clearest physical traces archaeologists have of symbolic communication existing in the human species, alongside things like early art and burial rituals. One of the most consistently supported theories for why this specific behavior emerged is that early body decoration functioned as a visible signal of group identity and social status. In small hunter-gatherer bands, and later in larger tribal societies, the ability to instantly and visually identify who belonged to your group, who held particular social roles, and who had earned specific achievements or status would have carried enormous practical value. A specific pattern of pigment applied to the face or body could function similarly to a uniform or a flag does today, conveying complex social information at a glance, without requiring a single word to be spoken, which would have been especially valuable for coordinating group activities like hunting, warfare, or ceremonial gatherings involving people from multiple different bands who might not share a common spoken language. Beyond group identity, researchers have found substantial evidence that early pigment use served an important role in health and protection as well, which complicates the idea that this behavior was purely decorative in the modern cosmetic sense. Red ochre in particular has natural antimicrobial and insect-repelling properties, meaning applying it to the skin may have provided genuine protective benefits against infection, biting insects, and even some level of protection from harmful ultraviolet sun exposure, similar in some ways to how modern sunscreen functions. This practical protective function likely existed alongside, and probably reinforced, the symbolic and social functions of pigment use, since a practice offering both tangible physical benefit and meaningful social signaling would have been far more likely to persist and spread across generations than one offering only one of those two benefits alone. Ritual and ceremonial use represents another significant thread in this story, and archaeological evidence for this specific function is remarkably direct in certain cases. Numerous ancient burial sites have been discovered where red ochre was deliberately applied to human remains before burial, sometimes covering the entire body in a thick, deliberate layer. This practice appears across multiple unrelated ancient cultures separated by vast distances and time periods, which strongly suggests pigment held significant symbolic meaning connected to death, the afterlife, or spiritual belief systems, rather than functioning purely as an everyday practical or decorative behavior. Some researchers have proposed that the deep red color of ochre may have symbolically represented blood and, by extension, life force, making its application to the deceased a meaningful ritual act tied to beliefs about death, rebirth, or spiritual transition that we can only partially reconstruct today. Sexual selection and attraction signaling represent yet another compelling explanation researchers have proposed, and it connects to broader patterns seen across the animal kingdom in species that use visual displays during mate selection. Enhancing specific facial features through color, particularly features linked to youth, fertility, or perceived health, such as lip color, cheek flush, or eye definition, could plausibly have functioned as a visual signal of reproductive fitness, similar in underlying function to how certain bird species use vivid plumage coloration during courtship displays. This theory doesn't require early humans to have consciously understood any evolutionary reasoning behind the behavior. It only requires that individuals using pigment in ways that happen to enhance perceived attractiveness experience some reproductive advantage over those who didn't, which is more than sufficient for a behavior to become deeply embedded and widespread across a population over enough generations. What makes early pigment use especially fascinating from an anthropological standpoint is how remarkably consistent certain patterns are across cultures that had absolutely no contact with one another throughout most of human history. Indigenous societies across Africa, the Americas, Australia, and the Pacific Islands independently developed traditions of facial and body pigmentation using naturally available materials, frequently for strikingly similar underlying purposes, marking important life transitions such as puberty or marriage, signaling warrior or leadership status, and preparing for significant ceremonial or spiritual events. When a behavior this specific and detailed emerges independently across civilizations that never once communicated with each other, anthropologists take this as particularly strong evidence that the underlying psychological and social drive behind it isn't a specific cultural invention. It's likely a deeply rooted, cross-cultural feature of human social psychology itself. The transition from natural pigments to what we would more immediately recognize as cosmetics happened gradually as human societies grew more complex and technologically sophisticated. Ancient Egyptian civilization, for example, developed remarkably advanced cosmetic practices thousands of years ago, including kohl eyeliner made from ground minerals, which served both a symbolic religious function tied to protection from the evil eye and a genuinely practical function in reducing harsh desert glare and potentially offering some antibacterial protection against eye infections common in that environment. This demonstrates something important about how cosmetic practices evolved over human history. They rarely serve just one single function in isolation. Instead, practical, symbolic, social, and aesthetic purposes tended to layer on top of each other simultaneously, reinforcing and strengthening one another rather than existing as separate, competing explanations for the same underlying behavior. It's worth noting that early cosmetic and body decoration practices weren't exclusively or even primarily associated with any single gender across most documented ancient and indigenous cultures, which stands in noticeable contrast to many modern, especially Western, cultural assumptions about who wears makeup and why. Archaeological and anthropological evidence shows men in numerous ancient and indigenous societies applying pigment for status signaling, ceremonial preparation, and protective purposes just as extensively as women did in many of these same cultures, if not in certain documented societies, considerably more so, particularly in contexts related to warfare, leadership display, and spiritual ritual. This detail is a genuinely important one, because it suggests that many of the strict, specific gender associations frequently attached to cosmetic use in various parts of the modern world are far more culturally specific and historically recent developments than most people commonly assume. Neuroscience research adds a further layer of understanding to why this behavior might have proven so evolutionarily persistent and widespread across human societies over such an enormous span of time. Studies on human facial perception consistently show that certain color and contrast patterns applied to the face, patterns strikingly similar to the enhancement patterns found in many modern and historical cosmetic traditions, measurably increase how quickly and how positively other humans perceive and respond to that face, even in study participants who have no conscious awareness whatsoever of any cosmetic application having taken place. This suggests our brains may have evolved specific, deeply ingrained visual preferences for certain facial contrast and color patterns over an extremely long evolutionary timescale, Patterns that early humans may have intuitively discovered and begun deliberately enhancing through pigment use long before anyone possessed even the beginning of a conscious scientific understanding of why those particular patterns felt so consistently and powerfully appealing to other people. Put all of these threads together, and early human pigment use stops looking like a strange, disconnected historical curiosity and instead reveals itself as a remarkably early and sophisticated expression of nearly everything that would eventually come to define complex human culture. It combines practical, tangible protection from environmental and biological threats, deep symbolic and spiritual meaning tied to identity, ritual, and belief, powerful and highly effective social signaling of group identity and individual status, and evolutionary attraction dynamics rooted in deep visual preferences. The human brain evolved over an extraordinarily long timescale. Modern makeup, sitting today in bathroom drawers and cosmetic bags around the entire world, carries an unmistakable, direct evolutionary lineage stretching back roughly 100,000 years to the very first humans who deliberately ground colored stone into fine powder and, quite intentionally, decided to change how the world would visually perceive them.